Hello everyone and welcome to the BRR Media Legal Brief, where we bring you the latest legal issues affecting corporate Australia. I'm Kate Ritchie. Now, companies who are liable under the carbon pricing mechanism are running out of time to report their interim emissions number and also surrender eligible emissions. And joining us to provide some last-minute tips is Fiona Melville, who's a partner at K&L Gates. Fiona, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Fiona, before we look at this, there's been some interesting developments last night with the vote in Europe. Could you take us through that first?
Sure. Well, the vote in Europe was a vote to postpone auctioning of EU allowances. And there's 900 million allowances that were proposed to be delayed. Now, the reason for the delay was because there's something like 1.7 billion allowances that are sitting in accounts across Europe. So because there's 1.7 billion, the price has really dropped. So the idea was if we postponed, or if Europe postponed the 900 million auction for a few years, that would bring the price of the existing units up. However, the vote was very narrowly defeated, but it was interesting to see that it was quite a narrow defeat. There was something like 334 votes for, to stop, to say that there should be no delay in the scheme, in the units, and then 315 against that. So there was just a 19 vote difference, and there was also 63 abstained MPs who abstained from voting. And I think the reason really why they decided that the auctions should carry on is because quite a lot of countries obviously across Europe are still in dire financial difficulties. So the proponents who wanted the auctions to carry on and therefore the price to remain low were primarily the Eastern European states, Poland, but also interestingly Britain and Italy supported that.
What is the price in Europe at the moment?
Well, as at close of business last night, it was $4 Australian, so it's obviously much, much lower than the $23 that we have with our fixed price units.
Well, how will this impact Australia, do you think?
Well, at the moment, of course, we have the fixed price period, and the fixed price period carries on until the 1st of July 2015. But from the 1st of July 2015, then we moved to having the price set by the market. And because Europe is such a large market, it's likely to be a price setter for the Australian market. So in 2015, if that price of $4 was still the price in 2015, then we're talking about businesses paying $4 rather than $23. So obviously that's a significant difference for Australian businesses as compared to European businesses.
Well, moving back to Australia, I understand that the first reports of liability and also payment of carbon units is coming up in June.
Yes. Yes, so on the 17th of June, that's the actual final cut-off date. Liable entities, if they don't want to pay a shortfall charge, will need to surrender carbon units to the regulator.
We hear a lot about an interim emissions number. How is that determined?
The interim emissions number represents roughly 75% of the full emissions number for the full year. So what the default position is that entities can just rely on their 75% number for last year, so that was 11-12 year. But if entities are concerned that actually their emissions for the current year are going to be less than that figure, the Act has the ability for them to put forward a different figure in order to say to the regulator, well, although my emissions number last year was, say, 200,000, this year it's 150,000. Now, in order to put forward that figure, they really need to have audited those results.
So what happens if an entity gets the estimate wrong? Could they be facing a penalty?
Yes, so if they get that estimate wrong in June, then they can have an estimation error that's then applied to them in February when the true-up or the final amounts are determined. So it's very important for them to have their figures audited. If they have the figures audited, then the regulator has the ability to relieve them from paying that estimation error. And the estimation error is 130% of their price, so it's a significant amount. So the regulator would probably relieve them of the penalty if they'd had their figures audited and if they had given to the auditor as much information as they possibly could. I mean, the idea of the estimation error is to make sure that liable entities are doing the right thing, that they are reporting their emissions number in as honest a way as they can.
What happens if in circumstances where, say, the auditor is uncertain?
If the auditor is uncertain, and that might well be because there's simply an element of doubt as to what the emissions are, and going forward for the last 2 months of the year, it may be that the entity's not really sure what that emissions number is likely to be for the last 2 months. In those scenarios, they would probably be much better off to surrender a surplus amount, because if they surrender a surplus amount, it's really about a cash flow issue. So, okay, they're paying more money in June than they might need to have paid, but on the other hand, when it comes to February, they won't have to pay that same amount. Whereas if they do it the other way around and they underestimate, then yes, they're not paying that amount in June, but come February, they have to pay that figure plus then another 30% penalty. So for entities that are not sure, they'd be better off overestimating their figure or just simply using that 75% default.
And would you recommend, if they don't want to use an independent auditor because it's too costly, that they go with that 75% there as well?
Yes, I think it would be very unwise to put forward a different figure if you haven't had your emissions audited. I think it's just be too dangerous. And the regulator in that scenario probably wouldn't have the power to relieve you from the penalty, because the regulator would probably say, well, you haven't acted reasonably, because to act reasonably, you really should have obtained an audit. So,
for entities that have determined their interim emissions number, what's the next step?
What they have to do is, as I say, have submitted that number to the regulator, and then they have to actually surrender carbon units to the regulator by the 17th of June.
And where do they get the carbon units from?
There's primarily 2 ways, or 3 ways really. One is then the ability to buy carbon units that have been issued to other parties for free. So for heavy industry that may have had free units issued, but then finds that they have put in place reduction measures so that they don't need themselves to surrender those units, they can sell them. Secondly, there are some units available from the Carbon Farming Initiative, so they're called Kyoto units, that are available in small numbers at the moment, and they're up to 5% of liability can be met by those. And then finally is the carbon units that are the fixed price units that the regulator issues. And what happens is the entity goes into its Australian National Registry of Emission Units account, indicates to the regulator how many it wants to buy. The regulator then sends out an invoice, and the entity then pays that invoice. And all of that has to be done, obviously, by that cut-off date.
Well, you mentioned that the cut-off date is 15th of June. Can companies wait till then to do anything, or should they start now?
I think they should start now, because it's really a 3-step process. Basically, they make the request, then the regulator issues the invoice, then they have to pay the invoice. And with a lot of entities, the figures are going to be, a significant amount of money. So they may need director sign-off. They need to possibly look at their internal policies. Some entities might have, for example, 30-day payment terms they have to abide by. So the regulator, recognising this, has the units up for sale from 1st of April. So it is possible to go and start buying those now, yes.
And what happens if an entity fails to surrender the required number of units by the cut-off date?
Then there'll be a shortfall. And so it's likely to happen for those default entities that have got the 75% of last year. Obviously, the regulator has that information, because that information comes from the reports they filed under the National Greenhouse Energy Reporting. So if they have a shortfall, then they will be charged 130% of each unit that they're short, and that has to be paid 5 business days after the cut-off date. So they have to do that straight away.
And are there any entities that are going to be relieved from this interim surrender obligation?
Yes, just the entities that are under the threshold of 35,000, they won't have to make this interim payment in June. They will have to make the payment, obviously, in February. So if an entity is on the border of that 35,000 and they genuinely feel that this year's emissions are going to be under the 35,000, then they certainly would want to be writing to the regulator and explaining that.
Well, Fiona, some interesting insights as always. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And viewers, thank you for joining us. We hope that you can join us next week for our legal brief.